The glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows in the executive lounge felt cold against Elias Thorne's forehead, a stark contrast to the humid, suffocating memory of the last time he'd been in the city. Outside, the skyline of Seattle was a jagged crown of steel and gray mist, indifferent to the man who had returned to claim it. Elias straightened his silk tie, the fabric sliding through his fingers with a lethal smoothness. 3 years ago, his hands had been shaking so violently he couldn't even grip a steering wheel. That was the night the world ended, the night he walked into his home to find his wife, Sarah, and his childhood best friend, Julian, amidst the wreckage of a betrayal so absolute it felt like a physical amputation. They hadn't even looked ashamed. They had looked pitying. "You were always too focused on the climb, Elias," Julian had said, his voice laced with a hollow, jagged edge of triumph. "Sarah needs someone who's actually present, not a ghost in a suit." Sarah hadn't said anything. She had just looked at him with those amber eyes that used to represent home, and reached for Julian's hand. Now, Elias was the CEO of Vanguard Holdings, the conglomerate that had just finalized the hostile takeover of the firm Sarah and Julian had built their lives around. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was the storm. He stepped toward the heavy mahogany doors of the main boardroom. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear, but with a rhythmic, pounding anticipation that tasted like copper and salt. He could smell the faint, lingering scent of expensive floor wax and the ozone of the cooling system. "Mr. Thorne," his assistant, Marcus, whispered, holding out a tablet. "The board is seated. Mrs. Vance and Mr. Sterling are present. They believe they are meeting the new owner to discuss strategic alignment. They have no idea it's you." Elias paused, his hand hovering over the brass handle. He thought of the 3 years spent in the dark, rebuilding himself from a broken shell into a monolith of industry. He thought of the empty apartment, the silenced phone, and the way the word love had become a foreign tongue. "Strategic alignment," Elias murmured, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "That's a polite way of saying the foundation is about to shift." He pushed the doors open. The room was silent, the air thick with the tension of middle management anxiety. At the far end of the long table sat Sarah. She looked exactly the same, yet entirely different. Sharper, perhaps, her hair pulled back in a professional knot that lacked the softness he used to tuck behind her ear. Next to her, Julian sat with the practiced ease of a man who thought he had won the game of life. As Elias stepped into the light of the chandelier, the oxygen seemed to vanish from the room. Julian's smirk didn't just fade. It disintegrated. Sarah's pen hit the table with a sharp clack, rolling unheeded toward the edge. Her face went an ashen, translucent white, her lips parting as if to scream a name she no longer had the right to speak. Elias didn't stop until he reached the head of the table. He didn't look at their shock. He looked at the empty chair, his chair. "Good morning," Elias said, his voice a calm, resonant cello in the sudden vacuum. "I believe we have a lot to catch up on." He sat down, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt the ground beneath him stop shaking. But as he looked into Sarah's wide, trembling eyes, a flicker of something he hadn't planned for, a sharp, stinging pang of grief, threatened to crack the armor he had spent 1,000 days forging. Reflection question. Have you ever been in a position where the person who hurt you most was suddenly forced to face the person you've become? How did that moment change your perspective on moving on? Leave a comment below. I want to hear your stories of resilience and the moments that defined your comeback. The silence in the boardroom was not empty. It was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the lungs of everyone present. Elias watched the color drain from Julian's face, turning the man's expensive tan into a sickly grayish hue. This was the man who had been his brother since they were 7 years old. The man who knew Elias's father was a drunk and his mother was a ghost. The man who had stood as best man at his wedding while secretly planning to dismantle his life. Julian's fingers twitched on the table, a tell Elias remembered from late-night poker games in college. "Elias." Julian finally managed, his voice cracking like dry parchment. This is impossible. You disappeared. The bank said. "The bank said I was insolvent," Elias finished for him, his tone conversational, almost pleasant. "And they were right. 3 years ago, I had nothing left but a suitcase and a debt I couldn't pay. But as it turns out, Julian, when you lose everything, you stop being afraid of the fall. You start looking for the draft that will help you rise. Elias turned his gaze to Sarah. She hadn't moved. She looked like a statue carved from ice. Behind her professional exterior, Elias saw the woman who used to read poetry to him in the rain. The woman who knew he hated the dark because of the years he spent locked in a cellar. Seeing her now, sitting in the office he had helped her secure, fueled by the capital Julian had essentially stolen from their joint ventures, sent a ripple of cold fire through his veins. "You look well, Sarah," Elias said softly. It was a lie. Up close, he saw the faint shadows under her eyes, the way her wedding ring, a new one larger and more ostentatious than the simple gold band he'd given her, seemed to weigh down her hand. "Elias, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We didn't know where you went. We tried to find you. To apologize? Or to make sure I wasn't going to jump off a bridge." Elias stood up, walking slowly around the perimeter of the room. He felt the eyes of the other board members, strangers to him, but essential pieces of the machinery, tracking his every move. Elias wasn't just a CEO. He was a man who had spent 3 years in the brutal, high-stakes trenches of Singapore and London, clawing his way into the good graces of the elusive billionaire Marcus Vane. Vane hadn't wanted a protege. He had wanted a weapon. And Elias had volunteered. He had spent those years suppressing every human instinct. He had learned to sleep 4 hours a night, to analyze a company's soul through its ledgers, and to forget the sound of Sarah's laughter. But standing here, the scent of her perfume, white lilies and bergamot, hit him like a physical blow. It was the scent of his greatest joy and his deepest humiliation. "Let's be clear," Elias said, leaning his hands on the back of Julian's chair. Julian flinched, pulling away. "I am not here for a reunion. I am here because Vanguard Holdings owns 51% of Sterling and Vance. Your boutique architectural firm has been bleeding cash for 18 months. You've been overextending on luxury contracts that never broke ground. You were 3 weeks away from bankruptcy." He looked at the two of them. They had built this firm as a monument to their new life together, naming it after their combined surnames. "I didn't buy this company to save it," Elias continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "I bought it because I wanted to see what happened to the dream when the dreamer returned." Julian found his courage, standing up to face Elias. He was shorter, his posture defensive. "You think you can just walk in here and take what we built? This is our life, Elias. Sarah and I, we have a child now. A son." The air left Elias's lungs. A son. A jagged image flashed in his mind. Sarah, 3 years ago, telling him they should wait to start a family until the business was stable. She had been on the pill. Or so he thought. The timeline turned like a knife in his gut. "Leo," Sarah said, her voice stronger now, protective. "His name is Leo. He's 2 years old." Elias felt the foundation of his carefully constructed hatred shudder. He looked at Julian, then back to Sarah. The betrayal hadn't just been a theft of his present. It had been a theft of a future he hadn't even known was possible. "A son," Elias repeated, the words tasting like ash. He straightened his jacket, his face becoming an unreadable mask once more. "Then I suggest you both start thinking very carefully about how you're going to provide for him. Because as of 9 a.m. this morning, Julian, you are suspended pending an audit of the firm's discretionary spending. And Sarah." He paused, looking into those amber eyes. "You will report to my office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. We have a lot of work to do if you want to keep your name on the door." He turned on his heel and walked out, leaving the ghosts of his past to suffocate in the silence of their own making. The executive office of Vanguard Holdings felt more like a glass fortress than a place of business. Rain lashed against the windows, blurring the Seattle lights into smeared neon ghosts. Elias sat behind his desk, the blue light of his monitor reflecting in his eyes as he pored over the forensic audit of Sterling and Vance. He had expected to find incompetence. He had expected to find the remnants of Julian's ego-driven spending. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, Elias found something far more sinister. There were holes in the accounts. deep, jagged gashes where millions of dollars had vanished into offshore shells. It wasn't just poor management. It was embezzlement. And the digital trail didn't lead to Julian. It led directly to Sarah's private accounts. Elias leaned back, his breath hitching. The woman he had loved, the woman he thought was a victim of Julian's manipulation, appeared to be the architect of a massive financial fraud. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. Elias didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of lilies preceded her. The doors were unlocked, Sarah said, stepping into the room. She wasn't wearing her power suit anymore. She wore a simple trench coat, her hair damp from the rain, looking startlingly like the woman who had promised to grow old with him in a small cottage by the sea. "You shouldn't be here, Sarah," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "The legal team is already drafting the subpoenas." "I didn't come here as a partner of the firm," she said, walking toward his desk until she was only a few feet away. The light hit her face, revealing the raw exhaustion etched into her features. "I came because Julian is spiraling. He's terrified of you, Elias. He's talking about solutions that involve fleeing the country. He wants to take Leo." Elias stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. "And why should I care? You chose him. You chose his bed, his life, and apparently, his penchant for white-collar crime." He spun the monitor around, the spreadsheets glowing like an indictment. "Explain the $12 million sitting in a Cayman account under your maiden name, Sarah." Sarah's eyes widened, but she didn't flinch. Instead, her knees seemed to give way, and she sank into the guest chair, burying her face in her hands. A jagged, broken sob escaped her, a sound so visceral it pierced through Elias's armor. "I didn't steal that money, Elias," she whispered through her fingers. "I saved it." "Saved it? From whom?" "From Julian," she snapped, looking up with eyes brimming with tears and a terrifying fire. "3 years ago, when you left, I thought I was choosing a partner who would be there. But Julian isn't who you think he is. He didn't just want me, Elias. He wanted your life. He wanted to be you. He started gambling with the company's assets 6 months after you vanished. He's deep in debt to people who don't use lawyers to collect." She stood up, her hands trembling as she reached across the desk, stopping just short of touching his hand. "I shifted the money to hide it. I knew if he found it, he'd blow it on a baccarat table in Macau. I was trying to build a safety net for Leo. I knew the crash was coming. I just didn't know you would be the one to trigger it." Elias felt the air in the room grow thin. The narrative he had built for 3 years, that he was the victim and they were the villains, was fracturing. "If this is true," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet, "why stay with him? Why have a child with a man you can't trust?" Sarah took a shaky breath, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Because I was broken, Elias. And when you're broken, you cling to the first hand that offers to pull you up, even if that hand is covered in filth. And Leo." She looked up, a bittersweet smile touching her lips. Leo was the only good thing to come out of the wreckage. Suddenly, the heavy doors of the office burst open. Julian stood there, his tie undone, his eyes bloodshot and wild. He wasn't surprised to see Sarah. He looked like a man who had finally run out of places to hide. In his hand, he gripped a thick manila envelope. "I knew you'd be here, groveling," Julian spat at Sarah, before turning his venomous gaze toward Elias. "You think you've won? You think you can just buy back the life I took? You're wrong." Julian threw the envelope onto the desk. It slid across the polished wood, stopping at Elias's chest. "Go ahead, CEO," Julian sneered. "Open it. See what your precious Sarah has been keeping from you. See why she really stayed with me." Elias looked at Sarah. She had gone deathly pale, her hand flying to her throat. "Julian, don't," she gasped. With a slow, deliberate motion, Elias opened the envelope. Inside were medical records. Not for Sarah. Not for Julian. They were paternity tests. Dated 2 years ago. Elias's eyes scanned the results, the world beginning to tilt on its axis. Result: 99.9% match. Father: Elias Thorne. The room went silent. The only sound was the frantic drumming of the rain. Leo wasn't Julian's son. He was Elias's. "She lied to you for 3 years, Elias." Julian laughed, a jagged, manic sound. "She let you believe I was the father so you'd stay away. She was afraid of your ambition. She was afraid you'd take the boy and bury him in your work just like you did to her." Elias looked at Sarah. She was shaking, her face wet with tears, unable to meet his eyes. The son he had mourned, the future he thought was stolen, was alive. And he had been used as a pawn in a game of emotional warfare. "Is it true?" Elias whispered, the paper crinkling in his grip. Sarah finally looked at him, her voice a mere ghost of a sound. "I was going to tell you. But then you were gone. And I was so scared, Elias. I was so alone." Elias didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel the cold satisfaction of the CEO. He felt a roar of primal protective rage and a devastating soul-crushing hope. "Get out," Elias said to Julian, his voice like grinding stones. "What?" Julian blinked, his smirk faltering. "Get out," Elias roared, slamming his fist onto the desk. "Before I have security throw you off the roof of this building. You're done, Julian. Your accounts are frozen. Your reputation is ash. If you ever breathe near my son again, I will spend every cent of the Vanguard fortune to ensure you never see the light of day." Julian, realizing the predator had finally truly awakened, backed away, stumbling out of the room. Elias stood there, the paternity test trembling in his hand, looking at the woman who had both destroyed him and given him the only reason to live. Reflection question. When a secret this big comes to light, is it possible to ever truly forgive the person who kept it? Can a foundation built on lies ever support a new beginning? Share your thoughts in the comments. This is a turning point we need to talk about. The silence that followed Julian's exit was more violent than his shouting had been. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room until Elias felt his lungs might collapse. He looked down at the paper in his hand, the clinical, cold font of a laboratory report that held the weight of 1,000 suns. Leo Thorne. The name echoed in his mind, replacing the image of the man he thought he had become with the man he could have been. He looked at Sarah. She was huddled in the chair, her damp hair clinging to her cheeks, looking less like the executive who had betrayed him and more like a ghost seeking a place to rest. 3 years, Elias whispered. The words felt like shards of glass in his throat. For 1,095 days, I woke up in cities where I didn't speak the language, driven by nothing but the desire to erase you. I lived in a desert of my own making, Sarah. And all that time, my blood was moving through the world without me. Sarah looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and raw. I didn't know how to find you, Elias. You didn't just leave. You vaporized. I went to the police, I went to your sisters, I went to the firm you used to consult for. Nothing. And then Julian was there. He told me you'd taken a payout to disappear. He showed me forged emails where you said you never wanted to see me again because I was dead weight on your career. Elias's grip tightened on the mahogany desk, his knuckles turning a ghostly white. And you believed him. After 7 years, you believed a man like Julian over the man who slept beside you. I was pregnant, alone, and the bank was foreclosing on the house because of the debts you didn't know Julian had run up in your name. Sarah's voice rose, a jagged edge of desperation cutting through her exhaustion. I had a choice: believe the lies and have a roof over my baby's head, or go into the street with nothing. I chose Leo. I will always choose Leo. Elias turned away, walking to the window. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, the city below a blurred kaleidoscope of misery. He felt a strange, terrifying duality. Part of him wanted to burn the world down for what had been stolen. Every first word, every first step, every night of holding a crying child. The other part of him, the part he thought he'd killed, wanted to fall to his knees and thank whatever God was listening that he wasn't as alone as he thought. Where is he? Elias asked, his back still turned. He's at home. With the nanny, Sarah said softly. Julian hasn't been. He hasn't been himself lately. I don't let them alone together much anymore. He's not going back to that house, Elias said, spinning around. The CEO had returned, but his eyes were burning with a different kind of fire. Neither are you. If Julian is as deep in debt to dangerous people as you say, that house is a target. The firm is a target. You're moving to the Vanguard residential suite at the Pierre. Tonight. Elias, you can't just. I can, he barked. I own the debt on your house, Sarah. I bought it yesterday morning. Technically, I'm your landlord as well as your boss. Don't fight me on this. Not when it comes to the safety of my son. The word son hung in the air, a bridge over an abyss. The next few hours were a blur of cold efficiency and simmering emotion. Elias watched from the shadows of his black SUV as Sarah went inside the house they had picked out together, now decorated with Julian's tasteless, expensive art, to gather Leo. When she emerged, she was carrying a bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. A small, sleepy face peeked out, eyes blinking against the streetlights. Elias felt a physical jolt in his chest, a sensation so powerful it felt like his heart was restarting after a long sleep. He didn't get out of the car. He couldn't. Not yet. He watched Marcus, his assistant, help them into the lead vehicle. As the motorcade pulled away, Elias saw a silver sedan pull out from a side street, following them at a distance. His eyes narrowed. Julian's creditors were already watching. The tension escalated over the following week. Elias stayed at the Vanguard offices, working 18-hour days. He was dismantling Julian Sterling's life with surgical precision. He filed for a full forensic audit, triggered a morality clause in the partnership agreement to strip Julian of his shares, and placed a private security detail on the Pierre suite. But the real tension wasn't in the boardroom. It was in the silence of the 42nd floor. Sarah was working in the office next to his. He had kept her on as a consultant, a move that baffled his board of directors but served his private purpose. He needed her close. He needed to know if he could ever trust her again, and he needed her to see what he had become. Not just a man of power, but the man she had thrown away. One afternoon, the door between their offices creaked open. Sarah stood there holding a tablet. The designs for the waterfront project, she said, her voice professional but strained. Julian had them scrapped to save on materials, but I kept the original blueprints. Your father's influence is all over them, Elias. The way the light hits the atrium. It's what you used to talk about. Elias didn't look at the designs. He looked at her. She was wearing a dress he recognized, one he'd bought her for their 5th anniversary. It was a small, agonizing olive branch. Why are you wearing that? He asked. Sarah looked down, her face flushing. I wanted to remember who I was before everything broke. I wanted to see if you remembered, too. She walked closer, the tension between them pulling like a physical cord. Elias, Julian is calling me. Every hour. He's losing his mind. He says if I don't give him the access codes to the offshore accounts, he'll tell the press everything. The scandal will tank Vanguard's stock. Let him, Elias said, stepping around his desk. He was inches from her now. He could smell the rain on her coat, the bergamot of her skin. I've spent 3 years building a fortress. A little mud from a snake like Julian won't stain the walls. It's not just the stock, Sarah whispered, her breath hitching as he leaned in. He knows how much you want Leo. He'll use him, Elias. He'll tell the world you're a predator who came back to steal a child from a loving home. Elias reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he pulled it back, clenching it into a fist. The urge to touch her, to forgive her, was a war inside him. He can try, Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous silk. But he's forgotten one thing. I'm not the man he betrayed anymore. I'm the man who owns the ground he stands on. Just then his phone buzzed. A message from the security detail at the Pierre. Intruder detected in the service elevator. High-level breach. Moving to lockdown. Elias's blood went cold. Julian wasn't going to the press. He was going for the boy. The drive to the Pierre was a blur of screeching tires and adrenaline that tasted like cold copper. Elias sat in the back of the SUV, his eyes fixed on the GPS tracker of the security team. Beside him, Sarah was a portrait of shattered composure, her fingernails digging into the leather upholstery until the seams groaned. "If he touches him, Elias," she whispered, her voice sounding like it was being dragged over gravel. "If he so much as frightens him." "He won't," Elias said, though the iron in his voice was a mask for the terror clawing at his own throat. He was a man who had mastered the art of the hostile takeover. But this was a merger of life and death. They arrived to a scene of controlled chaos. The lobby was cordoned off, and the silent, suit-clad Vanguard security team moved with the lethal grace of shadows. Elias didn't wait for the elevator. He took the stairs, his lungs burning, his heart hammering a rhythm of pure, protective rage. He burst into the residential suite to find the living room trashed. A heavy crystal vase had been shattered against the wall, and the scent of expensive lilies was drowned out by the metallic tang of a struggle. In the center of the room, Julian stood, disheveled and wild-eyed, holding a trembling Leo. The boy wasn't crying. He was silent, his large amber eyes, so much like Sarah's, fixed on the man who had been his father for 2 years, but who now looked like a monster. "Stay back!" Julian screamed, backing toward the balcony. "I know how this ends, Elias. You take the company, you take the girl, you take the kid, and I end up in a cell. I'm not going alone." Elias held up his hands, his movements slow, deliberate, the way one approaches a wounded animal. "Julian, look at me. This isn't about the money anymore. Put the boy down. You always thought you were better than me." Julian laughed, a jagged, hysterical sound that grated against the silence. "Even when we were kids. Mr. Perfect. Mr. Ambition. Do you know why I did it? Do you know why I took her?" Sarah stepped forward, her face a mask of agony. "Julian, please. Don't do this to Leo. I did it because I wanted to see you break, Elias." Julian shouted, ignoring her. "I wanted to see that untouchable Thorne ego crumble. But even then I failed. You just went away and grew stronger. You became a god while I became a thief." Julian leaned in closer to Elias, his voice dropping to a terrifying conspiratorial hiss. "But here's the secret, brother. I didn't just stumble into those debts. I was recruited. 3 years ago, when the firm started to slide. It wasn't bad luck. It was Marcus Vane." Elias froze. The name hit him harder than Julian's fist ever could. Marcus Vane. The billionaire mentor who had rescued Elias from the gutters of Singapore. The man who had given him the capital to start Vanguard. The man who had practically built the new Elias Thorne. Vane. Elias whispered. "He wanted you hungry, Elias," Julian sneered, a twisted sense of pride illuminating his face. "He saw your potential, but you were too domestic. Too soft. He told me if I cleared the path, if I took your wife and your reputation, he'd fund my lifestyle for a decade. He played us both. He used me to destroy you so he could rebuild you into his perfect little corporate shark." The world tilted. The betrayal wasn't a domestic tragedy. It was a curated masterpiece of social engineering. Sarah looked at Elias, her eyes wide with a new kind of horror. "Is it true?" she breathed. Elias felt a coldness settle into his marrow. Every success of the last 3 years, every billion-dollar deal, every brick in the Vanguard empire, it had all been a reward for his own destruction. He hadn't fought his way back. He had been moved like a pawn across Vane's board. In that moment of shared shock, the tension in the room snapped. Julian, distracted by his own revelation, loosened his grip on Leo. Elias didn't think. He didn't strategize. He moved with the primal instinct of a father. He lunged, his shoulder catching Julian in the chest, sent the man sprawling back against the glass. Sarah screamed, diving for Leo, pulling the boy into her arms and retreating into the hallway as the security team finally flooded the room. Elias stood over Julian, his chest heaving. He looked down at the man who had been his best friend, the man who had sold his soul to a billionaire just to be a shadow in Elias's light. "You're pathetic, Julian," Elias said, his voice devoid of all anger, replaced by a devastating, hollow pity. "You destroyed 3 lives for a paycheck from a man who doesn't even know your middle name." He turned away, not waiting for the police to cuff Julian. He walked to the hallway where Sarah sat on the floor, rocking a sobbing Leo. Elias sank to his knees beside them. For the first time, he reached out. His large, scarred hand touched Leo's small, soft shoulder. The boy looked up, his tears blurring the image of the stranger who had just saved him. "It's okay," Elias whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." As Leo reached out and curled a tiny, sticky hand around Elias's thumb, the CEO of Vanguard Holdings felt the last of his armor shatter. He looked at Sarah, and in the wreckage of the suite, amidst the revelation that his entire comeback was a lie orchestrated by his mentor, he saw the only truth that mattered. He had his son, and he was going to have to go to war with a titan to keep him. The fallout from Julian's revelation was not a slow burn. It was a flash fire. Within 48 hours of the confrontation at the Pierre, the world Elias Thorne had meticulously built began to liquefy. It started with a silent screen. Elias sat in his office, his fingers hovering over his keyboard, only to find his high-level access codes revoked. Then came the calls, not from clients, but from the compliance department. Marcus Vane had moved with the terrifying speed of a god king. By noon, Elias's personal and corporate accounts were frozen under the guise of an internal investigation into predatory acquisition tactics. Elias was a king without a kingdom, but the true blow came when the elevator doors opened to reveal a phalanx of federal agents. "Elias Thorne," a woman in a gray suit asked, flashing a badge. "We have a warrant for the arrest of Sarah Sterling, née Vance, on charges of grand larceny and interstate money laundering. We also have a court order to take Leo Thorne into protective custody pending a fitness hearing." The world turned to white noise. Elias stood in front of Sarah, his arm forming a barrier between her and the agents. Sarah was clutching Leo so tightly the boy began to whimper. "The money she moved was to protect the firm from Julian's gambling," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "That's for a jury to decide, Mr. Thorne," the agent replied. "But the paper trail says she stole $12 million from a Vane-subsidized entity. And since you've been harboring her, you're looking at obstruction." Elias looked at Sarah. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He realized then the depth of Vane's trap. Vane didn't just want Elias to be a shark. He wanted Elias to be his slave. By framing Sarah and threatening to put Leo into the system, Vane was forcing Elias to come crawling back to him, to beg for a pardon that would come with a collar and a leash. "Go with them," Elias whispered to Sarah, turning to look her in the eyes. "What?" Sarah gasped. "Elias, no. They'll take Leo." "They won't," Elias said, leaning in so close his forehead touched hers. "I'm going to the source. I'm going to end this tonight. Trust me, Sarah. For the first time in 3 years. Please trust me." Elias watched, his heart breaking in a way he hadn't known was possible, as Sarah was led away in handcuffs. Leo was taken by a social worker, his small hands reaching out for a father he had only just begun to know. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Elias had ever heard. He drove to Vane's estate, a glass and obsidian monolith perched on a cliff overlooking the sound. He bypassed the security, who stood aside as if they had been expecting him. Marcus Vane sat in a high-backed leather chair, a glass of amber scotch in his hand. He looked like an elder statesman, his silver hair catching the light of the fireplace. "You look tired, Elias," Vane said, not looking up. "That's what happens when you let your heart dictate your balance sheet." "You destroyed my life," Elias said, standing in the center of the room, his shadow long and jagged. 3 years ago. You whispered in Julian's ear. You funded his betrayal. I gave you a gift." Vane roared, standing up, his eyes flashing with a cold intellectual fury. "You were a brilliant architect with the soul of a poet. You were useless to the world of high finance. I gave you the pain necessary to become a titan. And look at you. You're the most feared man in the Pacific Northwest because of me." "I'm a man who lost his son today because of you," Elias countered. "You'll get the boy back," Vane said, waving a hand dismissively. "Once the woman is in prison. She's a distraction, Elias. She's the anchor that will pull you back into the depths of mediocrity. Sign the loyalty contract. Become the CEO of Vanguard Global. I'll make the charges against her disappear, and you can raise the boy as your heir, under my tutelage. Elias looked at the contract on the desk. It was a golden cage. If he signed it, he would have his son, his money, and his power, but he would be a monster serving the man who had orchestrated his misery. Elias picked up the pen. Vane smiled, a thin, triumphant line. "Wait," Elias said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the signature line on the document. There was a secondary name listed as the primary beneficiary of the Vanguard Global Trust, a name that wasn't Vane's and wasn't Elias's. It was Sarah's father, Thomas Vance. The man Elias thought had died in a car accident 10 years ago. The man whose tragic death had left Sarah an orphan and provided the initial insurance money that started Elias's first firm. "Thomas is alive," Elias whispered, the air leaving the room. "Thomas never died, Elias," Vane said, his voice dripping with a new, darker satisfaction. "He's been my silent partner for 40 years. He didn't think you were good enough for his daughter then. He wanted to see if you could survive the vetted path. The betrayal wasn't just my idea, Elias. It was a father-in-law's test." Elias felt a cold, sickening realization. The betrayal hadn't started 3 years ago. It had started the day he met Sarah. His entire relationship, his marriage, his career. It was all a long-con performance by a family of elites who saw him as a biological experiment in grit. He looked at the security camera in the corner of the room. He knew Sarah was watching from a holding cell, or perhaps from the next room. He realized that even now, he didn't know if Sarah was a victim, or if she was in on the game from the very beginning. Elias dropped the pen. He didn't sign. "I'd rather be a ghost in the street," Elias said, his voice deathly calm, "than a puppet in your theater." As he walked out of the mansion, the rain began to fall again, and for the first time, Elias Thorne truly had nothing. No company, no wife he could trust, and no son in his arms. He was back at zero. But as he stood at the edge of the cliff, he realized that when you have nothing left to lose, you are finally truly dangerous. Elias stood on the rain-slicked pavement outside the Vane estate, the iron gates clicking shut behind him with the finality of a guillotine. The world was a blur of gray and shadow. For 3 years, he had been fueled by a righteous anger, a belief that he was the hero of a tragedy. Now, he was just a man who had realized he was the protagonist of a cruel, high-stakes farce. He walked until his lungs burned and his expensive Italian loafers were ruined by the mud of the Seattle outskirts. He had no phone. He'd smashed it to avoid Vane's trackers. He had no car. He had only the paternity test in his breast pocket, now damp and crumpled, and the image of Leo's face as the social workers led him away. He found himself standing before a dilapidated brick building in the industrial district, the Archives, a forgotten storage facility for the first firm he and Julian had ever started. It was a place Vane's lawyers would have overlooked because it was technically a liability, not an asset. Elias broke the lock with a rusted pipe, the sound echoing through the empty street like a gunshot. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old blueprints, and stagnant time. He sat on a crate in the dark, his head in his hands, waiting for the weight of the world to finally crush him. "You always did have a dramatic flair for the dramatic, Thorne." Elias bolted upright, his muscles tensing for a fight. Out of the shadows of the back office stepped a figure he hadn't seen in 3 years. It wasn't Julian. It wasn't an agent. It was Evelyn Reed. Evelyn had been the lead architect at his old firm, the woman Julian had fired the very day Elias disappeared. She had been the only one who had ever stood up to Julian's ego, and the only person who knew where the literal and figurative bodies were buried in the company's history. Evelyn. Elias rasped. "I've been watching the news," she said, leaning against a filing cabinet, a tablet glowing in her hand. "I saw the Vanguard takeover. I saw the arrest of Sarah. And I knew you'd eventually end up here. This is the only place left that doesn't have Marcus Vane's fingerprints on it." "You don't understand," Elias said, his voice cracking. "Vane and Sarah's father. They've been playing a game for decades. Sarah might be in on it. My son is in the system. I've lost." "You haven't lost," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through his despair like a diamond through glass. She walked over and handed him the tablet. "Because while Julian was busy gambling and Sarah was busy saving money, I was busy being bitter. I didn't just leave 3 years ago, Elias. I took the backdoor access codes to the internal servers of Sterling and Vance. And I've been recording everything for 3 years. Elias looked at the screen. It wasn't just financial records. It was encrypted video logs from the office security system. Private conversations Julian had held when he thought no one was listening. Look at the date, Evelyn whispered. Elias tapped a file from 2 years ago. On the screen, a pregnant Sarah was sitting in her office, sobbing. Julian was standing over her, his face twisted in a mask of cold fury. You will tell everyone it's mine, Julian's recorded voice hissed. If you tell Elias the truth, if you even try to contact him, Vane will pull the funding. Your father's legacy will be ash. I'll make sure you go to prison for the embezzlement I've already set up in your name. You want to protect that baby? You stay with me. You play the part. Elias felt a surge of heat so intense it nearly blinded him. Sarah wasn't a co-conspirator. She wasn't an elite playing a game. She was a hostage. She had been living in a psychological prison for 3 years, framed and blackmailed by Julian and Vane to keep Elias in the test. She didn't choose him, Elias breathed, tears finally stinging his eyes. She was protecting Leo from the very beginning. And there's more, Evelyn said, scrolling down. I have the proof that Thomas Vance isn't a silent partner. He's being blackmailed by Vane, too. Vane staged the car accident to gain control of the Vance estate. Your father-in-law isn't a villain, Elias. He's a captive. The realization hit Elias with the force of a tidal wave. The entire conspiracy was held together by one man's ego, Marcus Vane. And Vane had one weakness. He believed he had already won. Elias stood up, his height returning to him, his eyes clearing. The CEO was gone. The victim was gone. In their place was a father who finally knew the truth. Evelyn, Elias said, his voice a low, vibrating chord of determination. How quickly can you leak these files to a federal prosecutor I can trust? I already have a name, she smiled. But we need more than just files. We need Vane to admit it on a live feed. We need him to think he's finally breaking you. He wants me to sign a loyalty contract tonight, Elias said, a predatory smile touching his lips. He wants me to bow. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to give him the performance of a lifetime. While I'm in that room, I need you to bypass the Pierre's security and get to the social worker holding Leo. Tell her the CEO is coming for his son, but the father is bringing the cavalry. Elias looked around the dusty archive. This was where he had started with nothing but a dream. He was ending it with something much more powerful. The truth. One more thing, Elias added, pausing at the door. Can you get a message to the holding cell where they're keeping Sarah? What do you want to say? Elias thought of the 3 years of hatred he had carried, the coldness he had shown her in the boardroom, and the way he had let her be led away in cuffs. Tell her, Elias said, that the light is coming back. The drive back to Marcus Vane's estate felt like a descent into the belly of a leviathan. Elias sat in the back of a nondescript sedan provided by Evelyn, his hand steady, his mind a crystalline engine of strategy. He had spent years learning how to destroy companies. Tonight, he would learn how to destroy a god. The rain had tapered off into a haunting spectral fog that clung to the cliffs of the Sound. When Elias stepped back into Vane's study, the air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and aged tobacco. Vane was still there, a silhouette against the fire, the loyalty contract still sitting on the desk like a death warrant. I knew you'd return, Vane said, his voice a purr of cold satisfaction. A man like you can't breathe without the oxygen of power. You've tasted the summit, Elias. You can't go back to the valley. You're right, Elias said, walking slowly toward the desk. He looked at the pen, the heavy gold-plated instrument Vane used to sign away lives. I can't go back. But I've realized something, Marcus. You didn't build me to be a titan. You built me to be a mirror. You wanted to see if someone could be as hollow as you are. Vane chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. Philosophy is for the poor, Elias. Sign the papers. Sarah's transport to the federal detention center leaves in 20 minutes. One phone call from me, and the evidence against her is lost in a server migration. Another call, and Leo is returned to your custody tonight." Elias picked up the pen. He felt the weight of it, the weight of 3 years of lies. "Before I sign," Elias whispered, "I want to hear you say it. I want to hear the genius of the plan. How you turned my best friend against me. How you forced Thomas Vance to play dead while his daughter withered. Just for the record." Vane leaned back, the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable finally overriding his caution. "It was effortless," Vane bragged, gesturing with his scotch glass. "Julian was easy. Greed is a simple lever. But the beauty was the pressure on Sarah, telling her that if she ever reached out to you, I'd have you killed in whatever gutter you were hiding in. She stayed with Julian to keep you alive, Elias. And Thomas. He's in a gilded cage in Switzerland, watching his family fall apart on a monitor because I own every cent he ever made. It wasn't a test of grit, Elias. It was a harvest. I harvest excellence." "And the embezzlement?" Elias asked, his voice steady. "The 12 million. "Pittance," Vane spat. "I moved it myself. A digital breadcrumb trail to ensure she could never leave the fold. She's been a prisoner for 3 years, and she didn't even know the bars were made of my money." Elias smiled. It wasn't the cold corporate smile of the CEO. It was the smile of a man who had just closed the trap. "Thank you, Marcus," Elias said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small blinking device. Not a phone, but a high-gain transmitter Evelyn had rigged. "I hope the federal prosecutor liked the story. They've been listening to every word via the encrypted Vanguard server." Vane's face went from triumph to a gray, ashen mask of realization. You wouldn't. You'll go down with me. You're the CEO of the company that handled the transactions." "I'm not the CEO anymore," Elias said, throwing the pen onto the desk. "I resigned 10 minutes ago. Evelyn Reed is the whistleblower. I'm just a witness." Outside, the silence of the estate was shattered by the rhythmic thumping of rotors. Searchlights cut through the fog, illuminating the glass walls of the study. Blue and red lights began to snake up the long driveway. But the real climax wasn't the police. The heavy doors of the study burst open. It wasn't the authorities. It was Sarah. She looked disheveled, her coat torn, but her eyes were burning with a ferocity Elias had never seen. Behind her stood 2 of Elias's private security team, men who had remained loyal to him over Vane's payroll. "The transport was intercepted," Sarah said, her voice shaking with a mix of rage and relief. "Evelyn got to the agents. They were Vane's men in hired suits, Elias. They weren't federal agents. It was another staged kidnapping." Elias moved toward her, but his path was blocked by Vane, who had pulled a small silver pistol from his desk drawer. The old man was trembling, the facade of the Titan crumbling into the desperation of a cornered rat. "You think you can take this from me?" Vane screamed. "I made you." "You didn't make anything," Elias said, stepping directly into the line of fire, shielding Sarah. "You only broke things. But you forgot that when you break something, the edges become sharp." A single shot echoed through the room. Sarah screamed. But the bullet didn't hit Elias. One of the security team had moved with lightning speed, tackling Vane as the gun discharged into the ceiling. The struggle was short and brutal. Within seconds, the man who had played God was pinned to the floor, his face pressed against the silk rug he had paid a fortune for. Elias didn't look at Vane. He turned to Sarah. He took her hands in his, hands that were cold, shaking, and finally free. "Leo," Elias whispered. "He's safe," Sarah sobbed, collapsing into his arms. "Evelyn has him. He's waiting for us." In the distance, the real sirens grew louder. The empire of Vanguard was collapsing, the stocks were tumbling, and the headlines were already being written. But as Elias held the woman he had hated for 3 years, the woman who had been a silent martyr for his survival, he realized that the only strategic alignment that mattered was the one happening in this room. The final twist came as the police led Vane away. The lead investigator handed Elias a small, sealed envelope found in Vane's private safe. "This was marked for you, Mr. Thorne." to be opened upon Vane's death. Elias opened it. It wasn't a confession. It was a birth certificate. Not for Leo. For Elias. His father wasn't a drunk from the gutters. His father was Thomas Vance's brother. Elias wasn't a project Vane had found. He was the rightful heir to the Vance-Vane fortune that Marcus had stolen decades ago. The test wasn't to see if he was worthy. It was a 3-year attempt to break him so completely that he would never claim his inheritance. Elias looked at Sarah, then at the ruins of the office. He wasn't a self-made man. He was a man returning to a throne that had been his since the day he was born. The air in Seattle had finally cleared, the oppressive mist giving way to a crisp, golden morning that felt like the first true sunrise in 1,000 days. The glass towers of the city still stood, but the names on the doors were changing. The collapse of Marcus Vane's empire had been swift and total, a controlled demolition of a house of cards that had stood for far too long. Part 9. Satisfying conclusion. Elias Thorne stood on the deck of a modest beach house on Whidbey Island, far from the polished marble of Vanguard's headquarters. He wasn't wearing a silk tie or a bespoke suit. He wore a simple wool sweater, his sleeves pushed up, his hands holding a lukewarm cup of coffee. The silence here wasn't the heavy, anxious silence of the boardroom. It was the peaceful quiet of the tide pulling back from the shore. The legal battles were far from over, but the outcome was certain. Marcus Vane and Julian Sterling were facing decades in federal prison for conspiracy, kidnapping, and financial fraud. Thomas Vance, Sarah's father, had been located in Switzerland and was finally back on American soil, undergoing medical treatment to recover from years of psychological isolation. The Vance fortune was being restored, but Elias had already decided he didn't want it. Not for himself. He had placed the entire inheritance into a trust for the victims of Vane's predatory acquisitions, keeping only enough to ensure a quiet, secure life for his family. The sliding glass door creaked open behind him. Sarah stepped out, her face glowing with a softness Elias hadn't seen since they were 24 years old. The sharp, defensive edges of the CEO's wife had melted away, replaced by the woman who had survived a nightmare to protect the one thing that mattered. "He's awake," she whispered, leaning against the railing beside him. "He's asking if the tall man is going to take him to see the seals today." Elias felt a lump form in his throat. Over the last few months, the tall man had slowly become Dad. It was a transition that had cost more emotional labor than any billion-dollar merger, but it was the only achievement Elias actually cared about. "I promised him, didn't I?" Elias smiled, setting his coffee down. He turned to Sarah, taking her hands in his. The gold band on her finger was gone, replaced by nothing but her own skin, healing and free. "How are you feeling today?" "For the first time in 3 years," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear, "I don't feel like I'm waiting for the floor to drop out from under me. I'm not looking over my shoulder, Elias. I'm looking at you." They stood there for a long moment, the history of their betrayal, the lies of their parents, and the pain of their separation finally settling like sediment at the bottom of a deep lake. They weren't the same people they had been before the storm. They were scarred, tempered, and vastly more resilient. A small blonde whirlwind burst onto the deck, clutching a wooden boat. Leo skidded to a halt, his amber eyes bright with the boundless energy of a child who finally knew he was safe. "Dad, look, the boat is ready for the water," Leo shouted, holding the toy up like a trophy. Elias knelt down, eye level with his son. He didn't see a biological experiment or an heir. He saw a boy who deserved the world. "It's a fine ship, Leo, but a ship is only as good as its captain. Are you ready to lead the expedition?" Leo nodded solemnly, grabbing Elias's hand with a grip that felt like an anchor. As they walked down the wooden stairs toward the sand, Sarah followed, the three of them forming a silhouette against the sparkling water. Elias looked back at the city in the distance, the skyline no longer a jagged crown he had to conquer, but just a part of a past he had outgrown. He had walked into her office as a CEO looking for revenge, thinking that power was the only way to heal a broken heart. He had been wrong. He hadn't come back to take over a company. He had been brought back to find his way home. The storm had passed, and in its wake, something new was growing. Something honest, something earned, and something that could never be taken away again. We've reached the end of Elias and Sarah's journey. Do you believe that after so much trauma, a family can truly find peace, or are they forever defined by the scars of the past? Thank you for following this journey of betrayal and redemption. If you enjoyed this emotional roller coaster, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dive stories. Comment redemption below if you think Elias made the right choice in the end.